and our friend Albert Breer back here on the show. How you doing, Albert?
I'm good. I think there's an owner in the NFL who would call your coverage of the Mahomes podium session there circumcising the mosquito, right?
Okay. Oh, yeah, that would be Jerry Jones, right? That was what Jerry Jones said?
Yeah.
I didn't know he'd ever been to a bris, Jerry.
I did. That's one that stuck with me.
I don't know if Jerry's ever been to a bris before.
But
we never knew that. Look at you, TJ. Look at you. Fantastic. Let's get right into this whole conversation about Mahomes' ankle. What do you know? What do we know other than he says he's going to play, and it looks like it?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's certainly going to be limited. And there's different degrees of this sort of injury. High ankle sprain is probably the most poorly named injury in football because a lot of people look at it and say it's a sprained ankle. It's not. It's ligament damage. It's serious, and so obviously he's going to give it a go. I think the difference this time around versus last week, Rich, is that like last week you're playing off adrenaline a little bit, and then B, the Jaguars didn't have a lot of time to adjust what they were doing to deal with a less mobile Patrick Mahomes on the fly, whereas now, the Cincinnati Bengals and obviously their fantastic defensive coordinator Lou Anarumo have 7 full days to prepare for the possibility that Patrick Mahomes isn't going to be moving the same in the pocket and to game plan that. And so that to me is what's going to be fascinating about it. He's going to play. I'm not sure what his percentage he's going to play, but I think it's fair to say he's not going to be 100%.
What about Hurts' shoulder? Have we just not forgotten about it because it's overshadowed by Mahomes' ankle and the fact that the Eagles basically beat the Giants? I would say with one arm tied behind their back, especially since I saw Jason Kelsey with a one-armed pancake throw down. So are we just not paying as much attention to this anymore with Hurts?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that has to be managed. And look, like there have been quarterbacks who've had shoulder injuries in the past. I mean, Brady, I want to say it was the second time they lost to the Giants, so it would have been 11. Was playing with his shoulder actually harnessed through the playoffs that year. He has slightly separated shoulder. I remember talking about it with you on NFL Network. So it's not unusual that quarterbacks have shoulder injuries or that have to manage shoulder injuries, but it's not 100%. And, I talked to Nick Sirianni about this a couple of weeks ago, actually, after their Week 18 game. And he actually said to me that, like, the day he got hurt, and that was in Chicago, whatever it was, early December, I think, he compared the effort that that Hurts gave in staying in that game, called it like a Michael Jordan type of effort, in playing hurt. And then, he went on to say he certainly wasn't close to 100% today. That's Week 18. Well, wasn't 100%, over the weekend either. So, again, this is like sort of one of those management things where, Jalen Hurts isn't going to be 100% in these playoffs. And I think, dealing with what he's dealing with, with the sprain there in his shoulder, it's not going to be something that is going to be fixed with anything but rest. So they're managing it. Obviously the better they run the ball, the better it is for Jalen Hurts. But I do think, where, there was a governor on him in Week 18, and the way that they managed him, that governor came off a little bit in the wild card round, and I think it'll come off a little bit more in the championship game.
Albert Breer here on the Rich Eisen Show. Give me your favorite Joe Burrow story that you've heard that illustrates perfectly how spectacular he is and is becoming in the NFL.
This one's great. So I think and I would say this. I think a lot of people misjudge who Joe Burrow is because he doesn't pop physically the way that Patrick Mahomes or Josh Allen do, right? I think it's fair to say that. And the reason I think the right comparison for him is Brady is because Brady suffered from that 15 years ago. Like, I think there were a lot of people who didn't realize how great Brady was, going back 04, 05, 06, because he didn't pop physically the same way. Well, the one thing those two guys have in common is how they have this talent for diagnosing everything and being able to see everything on the field at once, right? So that's what Joe's been able to do. And a lot of times things look easy to him out there because he's doing things to make them easy. Like on the touchdown pass to Jamar Chase last week, he was moving the defense with his eyes. He was looking to his right, and that cleared out space to his left, which is why Chase was so open. and why Chase had so much room to run when he got the ball. Well, I asked his dad about this, and I did a big story on it with Joe and with Brian Callahan and with Zach Taylor over the summer. So I called Joe's dad, Jimmy, who still lives there in Ohio, and I asked him when the first time he'd ever seen this from Joe was. And he said, it's funny you asked that. He's like, so when we moved to Athens, Ohio, Joe was 8 years old. And he went and played youth football. It was his first time playing quarterback. And during camp of that year, getting ready for the youth football season at 8 years old, the head coach of the youth team noticed Joe was really smart and saw the game really well. So he gave him this one piece of autonomy where he said, if the A gaps aren't covered, you tap the center on his side to let him know that you're just going to run the ball. You're just going to sneak it yourself to pick up the yardage. In his first ever youth game, Rich, he did that and ran for a 70-yard touchdown. And Jimmy Burrow sent me the video to prove it. I mean, it is so, like, as an 8-year-old kid, and that's the best story I can give you on what's special about Joe and how innate it is. At 8 years old, his first game of organized football, his first game playing quarterback, he called an audible that resulted in a 70-yard touchdown. I think it's very much the same guy you're seeing now, obviously with a lot of hard work to get there in between.
I mean, he's amazing. I mean, he is just been overlooked in so many different ways. Until what we saw in LSU, and even then, there was a conversation about Tua and Herbert, and but then that went by the wayside prior to the draft, right? The Dolphins tried to trade up for Burrow, and the Bengals told everyone to pound sand, right? Like that's generally it with that story.
Yeah, and I think it was, the Dolphins, the owner, actually, in fact, I think was the one who was really kind of like, hey, like this is kid special, and they had him in, and like we should do everything we can to go get the kid. And Chris Breer tried. You know what I mean? Like they called the Bengals, and they tried. And I mean, like I've talked to Zach a few times about this. Like they told everybody who called them to get lost. You know what I mean? Like so they obviously saw something because. If you're looking at it and you're Cincinnati in that situation, you could have a bevy of picks to have Miami come up and get him, and you can still wind up with Justin Herbert or Tua, right? So, like at that point, Cincinnati, I think to their credit, saw the difference between Joe Burrow and everybody else and stuck to their guns and sat there and took Joe Burrow number one overall. So yeah, and I think the biggest thing, Rich, really, he's just a culture changer. You know what I mean? Like, and it's not like LSU wasn't a powerhouse program before, but you remember what they were before, right?
No, yeah.
Like defense, run game, they never. I mean, if LSU threw for 200 yards in a game, like it was like, whoa, where'd that come from? As good as they were, that's always what they were. It's just defense and run game. And when Les Miles was there, it was like Bo Schembechler, Big Ten football. Joe gets in there, and his first year they're okay, and then his second year he throws 60 touchdown passes.
It's
like,
crazy.
Where did that come from?
Well, it's also crazy too. He's got Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase, right? Just to name
right, and
two.
that helps.
Oh my goodness gracious! I mean, just the embarrassment of riches.
I've said this before, Rich. Don't you think we're all going to look back and I think we're going to look back in like 15 years, and like our kids are going to ask us like, wait a second, who was on the same college team?
Well, I mean, it's two of the 5 current MVP finalists, right? Burrow and Jefferson, and then there's Chase, who's, tremendous, and the Bengals have nothing but road in front of them. It's unreal, really, what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, even like you look at like that team overall. Like Edwards-Helaire was on that team.
Yeah, right.
Grant Delpit, like Patrick Queen, like that team was loaded.
Albert Breer here on the Rich Eisen Show. Let's talk about the aftermath of the weekend. And the 4 teams that lost, it's like different grades. It's like different DEFCONs, where house money for the Jaguars and Giants, technically, right?
Yep.
And then the Cowboys were viable, which is what Jerry said he wanted to have as a successful season, but not again in the championship game. And then the Bills were the odds-on favorite in so many different places to win the Super Bowl, and they only win once. So let's take the Bills first. What is the reason why you think they didn't go as far as the rest of the NFL media world thought that they would, me included.
I think there are a couple things. I think the first thing is they were playing with such a large margin for error, early in the year. And you remember how it started, the way they looked against the Rams, the way they looked against the Titans on that Monday night.
Mm-hmm.
And, I just feel like there were a lot of games, like the Patriot game at the end of the year, the Dolphin game in the wild card round are two recent examples of it, where their margin for error was so big that they could screw around and win games. And you sort of wonder if that caught up to them, where this team that had been blowing teams out all year, or they've been not playing very well and getting away with it, if that finally caught up with them. I also think there's something to be said for the fact that this is probably a pretty worn out group, and what they went through, all the way back to the tragedy in their area at the top supermarket last spring, to the two snowstorms that debilitated their area, to the DeMar Hamlin thing, added on to the football stuff, like the injuries, to guys like Von Miller and Micah Hyde. That's the other part of it. I just, I do. It's almost seemed like a team that was a little worn down and lacked spark, on Sunday. So those are the two things that stick out. And look, I think they have some work to do. I think they've got some hard questions to ask themselves, about the way they coached that game, and then where they are at certain spots on their roster. The good news for them is the hard part's taken care of. They've got premier players at premier positions. And so they should be good for the foreseeable future. The question is, what's it going to take to get them over the top?
What does Dallas do? I was saying yesterday, Albert, if Jerry really wants to blow it up, the opportunity to blow it up, which he doesn't like to do. Everyone is still informed by Jerry Jones in their mind's eye about what he did with Jimmy Johnson back in the 90s.
Yeah.
He doesn't want to blow stuff up.
That.
He doesn't do it. He doesn't. And I don't know if it was informed because by the fact that he did do it with Jimmy and regrets it, and he saw what he did, and now that keeps him without blowing things up. But the quarterback is there in Brady if he really wants to blow that up. And the coach is there in Sean Payton if he wants to blow that up. And he could just totally redo everything, blow it up, and deal with the aftermath, in 2025, 26, 27, with Sean Payton getting another new quarterback at some point. What do you think happens here with Dallas, Albert?
My experience being around that team, and I was on that beat 15 years ago, I think you're right, in what you're saying about Jerry generally exhibiting more patience than people realize, because again, they have it in their head that he's this gunslinger from Arkansas. You know what I mean? And really, he gave Dave Campo extra years all those years ago. He gave Wade Phillips extra years. He gave Jason Garrett extra years. And I actually think, on balance, Mike McCarthy did a pretty decent job this year. They were without their quarterback for 5 games. They went 4-1, I believe, through that stretch.
Oh yeah, their left tackles that was supposed to totally tear them apart.
Left tackle had a rookie ready to go, and who played great, their first-round pick. So I think there are a lot of things that they have going for them. To me, the question going forward is twofold. Number one, if you lose Dan Quinn, how do you manage that? Because I think Quinn has been such a huge part of what they've done, and it was to Mike McCarthy's credit that he made the coordinator change after his first year in Dallas and went and got Dan Quinn. So if you lose Dan Quinn, what's the plan? How are you going to replace him? Because he's been a huge part of their success over the last 2 years on that side of the ball, and developing guys like Micah Parsons and Trayvon Diggs. And then the second piece, I think, is just sort of who you are offensively. I think because Dak Prescott's on the contract he's on, you try to become a little bit more quarterback-centric. But when Dak's been at his best, they've really been more of a team that's built around the running game and that, I think manages games a certain way. And so the question is, do you get back to being that? My guess would be that Zeke Elliott's probably gone after this year based on the number for next year. And, then Tony Pollard's a free agent, so you've got that question there. Do they draft a running back? I just think offensively there's a little bit of a crisis of identity there where when things get really tough, where do we turn? And, I think that that's something that they're going to have to figure out over the course of the offseason. So it's not that I think a lot of the personnel, absent, again, the running back position, they got to figure that out. I think that like a lot of the personnel is in place. I think they just sort of have to figure out who they are and how to best utilize Dak Prescott because, there were points the year, the Jaguar game where he threw the pick six. Obviously, he wasn't great against the Niners, where it just looked like when they leaned on him in a certain way, he didn't really respond the way you'd want him to.
Albert Breer, Sports Illustrated, the MMQB senior NFL reporter. A few more minutes left with him. Does it seem like it's taken a long time for job openings to get filled, coaches, or what's going on there? What's happening?
I would say yes, and I think that's deliberate. The league wants that. The league wants these things to be drawn out, and there to be more of a process. And part of it's the Rooney Rule, part of it's the rules on what you can do with coaches who are still in the playoffs. They've sort of tightened all of that up, and so I think the NFL wants this to take longer. If you notice, like the GM searches were taken care of pretty quick. There were two of them. Monty Ossenfort and Rain Carthon were in place last week, and a big part of that is because playoff executives aren't affected the same way playoff coaches are. So if the goal was to do less affecting the playoff teams and give coaches who are still in the playoffs a fighting chance at these, I think that worked. That's a part of it. I think the other part of it is Sean Payton sort of hovered over some of these. And I'll tell you, Rich, I've said this from the start. Like, I wasn't convinced at the beginning of this that he was going to coach in 2023. I'm still not convinced he's going to coach in 2023.
Really?
I look at the situations that are out there right now. Does he want to marry himself to Kyler Murray? Does he want to marry himself to Russell Wilson? Is he willing to go to Houston? Is he willing to go to Carolina? I sort of look at like the landscape out there. And I know how much he likes living out there, like in your neck of the woods out there in Manhattan Beach. I think the Fox gig is a comfortable one for him. And, I think that there's some merit to the idea of just waiting for the right one to come along, and maybe the right one isn't there yet. I mean, you think about it, like we always have sort of thought of him as like the whiz kid he was. He's older now. Like he's in his 50s, and so this next shot he takes is, could be his last one as a coach. And so, I think that's part of the reason why he's taking his time here and why I think it's a real consideration for him to go back to Fox rather than returning to the sideline.
And I say this with all due respect to the coaches that are currently in their spots. Is it possible he could sit there and go, well, man, I would love Herbert, but the Chargers weren't ready to make that move yet, and they might not ever be ready to make that move. And, Brandon Staley may go and take that, team to the heights that they hope he can take them to. And, man, I would do Dallas, but, they're not ready to do that. And they also don't want to flip the one to New Orleans. So let me get free of that contract. I'll hang in Los Angeles for a while. And are there any other? Is that as simple as that, or
Oh yeah, I mean he's not going to say it. I mean he's friends with Mike McCarthy. You know what I mean? Like
sure.
He's like pretty close friends with Mike. He doesn't. I know. Like I can tell you for a fact. Like he felt awkward about like how, and people aren't going to believe me when I say it, but I really believe it. Like he felt like awkward about how he was sort of hovering over all of these jobs over the course of the fall.
Right.
So I do think like. But that's the reality of it. The reality of it is, like, could there be better jobs available next year? Absolutely, there could be. And by definition, like, here's the thing. By definition, 90% of these jobs aren't going to be great because, otherwise the person who was in it would still be there, right? Like, normally,
right.
like most of the jobs that are going to come open are going to have serious problems that you're going to have to work through. But yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly something that's got to be in the back of his head. It's the opportunity to stay in Los Angeles and work with Justin Herbert is there a year from now. Is that more attractive than what's out there right now for him? Maybe. Could Sean McVay walk away in a year and offer him the opportunity to stay in LA with the Rams? That could be something that could cross his mind. And then, like you said, like the Dallas thing, obviously he's been connected. He's very close to the Jones family. So, like, that's something to consider as well. Yeah. So I certainly think, like, it's almost like a team taking, like, a 2-year view of quarterbacks. You know what I mean? Like, where, like, if you're a team that's in the market for a quarterback this year, you're going to look at Bryce Young and C.J. Stroud and Will Levis. But you also might have your scouts take a peek at Caleb Williams and and Drake May, and I'll give you this, J.J. McCarthy next year, right?
Thank you.
You might have your scouts take that look at the second year.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's sort of that way. If you're Sean Payton, you got to look at this with a sort of long-term view because you might only have one more bite at the apple of coaching in the NFL.
And last one for you. This is a copycat league. The Bengals are back in the AFC Championship game for a second straight year. Well, what's with the Bengals not getting any phone calls asking for their DC and OC, right? Like,
yeah,
what's up
I
with
wish
that?
I had a better understanding. I mean, like I actually asked Zach about that on Sunday night, and I was asking about Lou in a room, in particular, and he was
Right.
he's like that one just doesn't make any sense to me at all, and I think Brian Callahan's similar. I think anybody who's had a 5-minute conversation with Brian Callahan, the guy's got head coach written all over him. Both those guys are excellent tacticians. They develop young talent. They've helped turn, the entire image. I mean, we think of the Bengals differently than we did 3 years ago. The entire image of a franchise has been turned over, and those guys are a huge part of it. So I wish I had a better answer for you, other than maybe their names haven't been in circulation for long enough.
Okay.
But I definitely think teams are missing the boat. Lou has got a ton of experience, is incredibly well respected and connected in the NFL. And again, Brian Callahan, all you got to do is call Peyton Manning and ask Peyton Manning about Brian Callahan. You'll find out. You know what I mean? To me, it's like Lou, you can pin it on the defensive thing, and I don't think that's totally fair either. But you say, okay, the trend is to hire young offensive coaches. With Callahan, it's like how is he not? With the Shane Steichens and Ben Johnsons and Ken Dorseys and all those other guys that are being talked about right now.
All right, I lied. I got one last one for you, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Interpret the Tom Brady response to his own podcast host, Jim Gray. If I effing knew what I was going to do, I'd effing done it already.
Did that sound kind of staged to you?
No, I don't think so. And everyone's talking about, look, if Brockman just shot up in his chair. No.
No.
I mean,
Brady's tone sounded sort of wooden. It didn't sound it sounded like forced. I don't know. It just sounded just staged.
All right, so that's your interpretation.
My reaction, but my reaction is I take it at face value. I do think I think he legitimately doesn't know what he's going to do. And so do I think he thinks he can still play? Yes. The question to me is not can he get himself in position to play 17 games. The question to me is can he dive all in once again? Because if he's going to go to a new team, there's a lot that goes into that. And you remember last year where he took the couple weeks off during training camp, and didn't he go to Robert Kraft's birthday party?
On a Friday night.
On a Friday night, and didn't travel with the team to Pittsburgh. You just sort of see these things, and look, Brady's got the right to do whatever the hell he wants, right? I don't think any of us would question that. But if you're talking about locking yourself into playing a full football season, and yet you were doing some of those things last year, I think that's probably the biggest question, right? It's not can I get myself ready to play on a Sunday? It's am I willing to make the 9-month commitment that it's going to take to ramp up, to prepare to play with a new team, and then actually play in the games and get myself through the season. I think that's the question that he's asking himself right now. But certainly, I think, depending on what happens in the next couple of weeks, the light will be left on for him in San Francisco. I think Vegas has a very real interest in him already. Tennessee, I think, is somebody to consider.
What about Miami? What about Miami?
Miami's the other one. Miami, look, I don't know how many people know this, but he's got a very close relationship with their minority owner, Bruce Beal, who is a big Boston business guy.
They don't have a first-round pick because of it. They don't have a first-round pick because of it, Albert. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, they tried before. A hand got in a cookie jar. That makes sense. I mean, it makes total sense.
Yeah, and you look at their roster. I mean, if Brady considered a couple of years ago, hey, I want to go play for Kyle Shanahan. Well, Mike McDaniel is the other side of Kyle Shanahan's brain. You know what I mean? Runs the same stuff. He's just as smart. And you'd be thrown to Tyreek Hill and to Jalen Waddle.
Yeah.
And you'd have a defense that's got horses on it now. Look, I think this is a factor too. This would be a factor too. Is his kids live there? And so I think I think all of that is all that's important stuff to consider, especially when a couple of those teams are on the other side of the country. We know 3 years ago when he made the decision to go to Tampa over the Chargers, a big part of that decision was he wanted to be closer to his son in New York geographically.
Albert, you're the best. Thanks for the time, man. Let's do this again soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Rich. Have a good one.
Right back at you. Everybody should check out Albert on Twitter at Albert Breer. All of his material on Sports Illustrated. He's awesome. Catch the Rich Eisen Show every single day on the Roku channel, 12 to 3 Eastern, for free.